"Sign it," my brother said, sliding a folder across the kitchen table without looking up from his phone. "It's just a formality." I looked at the papers. 12 pages, dense with legal language, authorizing him as sole executor of our mother's estate. She had been gone for 11 days. I didn't sign it. He finally looked up. His jaw tightened the way it always did when I didn't immediately agree with him. "Lorelei, Mom trusted me to handle this. You know you're not good with money." I'd been managing my own account since I was 19. I had zero debt. I had a 741 credit score. But I had learned, somewhere around age 12, that correcting my brother out loud only made things worse. So I said I needed time to read it. He said fine. He said it like it wasn't fine at all. That was February. By April, I understood exactly why he'd wanted me to sign. Our mother left 2 things of real value: the house in Tucson, where we'd both grown up, and the storage unit she'd been paying for in cash since before I was born. My brother got the house in the will. He was the oldest. He'd lived closest. He'd made sure his name was on every document my mother ever touched in the last decade of her life. The storage unit she left to me, just me, specifically by name, with a handwritten note attached to the will that her attorney read aloud in a voice that cracked slightly at the end. "Lorelei knows what to do with old things. She always did." My brother laughed when the attorney finished reading, a short, dismissive sound. "A storage unit, congratulations." His wife touched his arm and smiled at me with her mouth but not her eyes. "That's so sweet," she said. "Very sentimental." The unit was in a facility 40 minutes outside of Tucson and a stretch of desert highway where the pavement buckles every summer from the heat. I drove out there on a Thursday morning in late April with a bottle of water and no real expectations. The facility manager, a slow-moving older man with the sun-bleached key ring, walked me to Unit 114 and stood back while I worked the combination lock. My mother had sent me the combination in a birthday card 2 years ago. I'd assumed it was a mistake at the time, a random string of numbers tucked next to a drawing of a cake. It wasn't a mistake. The lock clicked open. I lifted the rolling door. I don't have a word for what I felt in that first second. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't anything I'd prepared for. It was more like the feeling of stepping off a curb you didn't know was there. A sudden drop. A recalibration. The unit was packed floor to ceiling, but not with junk. Everything was wrapped. Carefully, deliberately wrapped in acid-free paper and moving blankets, tagged with handwritten labels in my mother's small, precise handwriting. Paintings. Ceramics. A set of 6 matching chairs with curved legs and embroidered seats. A grandfather clock with a cracked face that my mother had once told me belonged to her grandmother's grandmother, and against the back wall, wrapped in so many layers of moving blanket that it looked like a sleeping giant, something large, something that took up a third of the unit by itself. The facility manager cleared his throat. "You need anything? I'll be in the office." I nodded without turning around. I was already moving toward the back wall. I need to back up. I need to explain what kind of family I come from, because otherwise none of this makes sense. My name is Lorelei. I'm 31. I grew up in Tucson with my mother and my brother, who is 7 years older than me and has been treating that age gap like a moral credential his entire life. Our father left when I was 4. I don't have many memories of him. What I do have are memories of watching my mother work double shifts at a hospital billing office, come home smelling like bad coffee and fluorescent lighting, heat up soup from a can, and still find time to sit with me at the kitchen table while I did homework. She was the kind of tired that goes all the way down, and she was, despite everything, relentlessly careful. She clipped coupons. She negotiated every bill. She never bought anything she didn't need, and she never threw anything away that had value. My brother inherited none of that. He moved to Phoenix in his mid-20s, married a woman whose hobby was renovating rooms she immediately lost interest in, and spent the next decade building an identity around the idea that he was a businessman. He had a company that did something with commercial real estate consulting. I was never entirely sure what it actually produced. What I knew was that he calls our mother every time the numbers didn't work out, and she helped him. Quietly, without telling me. I found that out at the estate meeting. There was a second page of documents the attorney presented. A record of financial gifts. My mother had given my brother $63,000 over 9 years. Small amounts, irregular, spread across enough time that no single transfer stood out. Every one of them labeled in her bank records as household support or family loan, though there was no paperwork attached to any loan. $63,000 on a hospital billing office salary, over 9 years. I sat in that attorney's office and did the math quietly in my head and understood. For the first time, Why there had never been money for me to go to a 4-year university. Why I'd done community college and then a certificate program instead. Why every time I needed something, a car repair, first month's rent, a plane ticket home for Thanksgiving, my mother had said, "I'm so sorry, honey, I'm a little short right now." She was never short. She was being drained. My brother had known. Of course he had known. And when the attorney finished reading the gift record, my brother said, very calmly, Mom wanted to invest in my business. It was her choice. He said it the way someone says a thing they've rehearsed. Smoothed down, edges filed off. I didn't say anything. I signed what I needed to sign, took my copy of the will, and drove home. I sat in my parking lot for 20 minutes. Then I started making a list. The unit had been prepaid through the end of the year. I had access. I had the combination. And my mother, who had been careful about everything her entire life, had left it specifically to me. Back to the storage unit. I spent 2 hours that first Thursday just doing inventory. I didn't unwrap anything fully, I just documented. Photographed every tag, every label. My mother's handwriting told me what each piece was, but not where it came from or what it was worth. A pair of oil paintings labeled Hudson River School, attributed. A ceramic vase labeled likely Rookwood, circa 1905. The chairs labeled possibly Herter Brothers, provenance unknown. I'm a paralegal. I work for a small firm in Tucson that handles estate and probate cases, which means I spend my days reading documents other people don't bother to read, and finding details other people don't bother to find. I am not an antiques expert, but I know how to research, and I know how to ask the right questions to the right people. I took 3 weeks of photographs to an appraiser named Wallace, who was recommended to me by one of the attorneys at my firm. He was in his 60s, operated out of a converted bungalow in Midtown, and had the specific energy of someone who had been surprised by nothing for a very long time. He looked at my photographs for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "The chairs are real." I said, "Real what?" Herter Brothers. New York, 1878, or thereabouts. I'd want to examine them in person, but the joinery in this photograph. He pointed to a detail I had barely noticed. That's not a reproduction. He kept scrolling. The Rookwood vase, I'd want to confirm, but the mark on the base looks correct. The paintings I can't call from a photo, but the Hudson River attribution, if it holds, could be significant. He paused on the last photograph, the one I'd taken of the back wall. The wrapped shape. What's under there? I told him I didn't know yet. He handed my phone back to me. Find out. I went back to the unit the following Saturday. It took me 45 minutes to unwrap. Layer after layer of moving blanket, then a layer of bubble wrap, then a layer of cotton batting, then a wooden crate that had been sealed with screws rather than nails. I borrowed a drill from the facilities maintenance closet and took the screws out one by one. Inside the crate, in a fitted foam surround, was a quilt. Not a decorative quilt. Not a craft store quilt. A Baltimore album quilt, hand-stitched, with a center medallion and 12 surrounding blocks, each one appliqued with a different botanical design. Roses, dahlias, oak leaves, a pineapple for hospitality in the old tradition. The fabric was aged but intact. The stitching was fine enough to make me hold my breath. On the back, in faded ink, a date, 1847. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit in the April heat and held a piece of cloth that was older than my state, and I did not understand yet what I was holding, but I understood that my mother had known. She had been protecting this. She had been paying $42 a month out of her carefully organized budget to protect this, and she had made sure it came to me and not to the son who had been liquidating her kindness for 9 years. I called Wallace from the parking lot. He was quiet for a moment after I described it. Then he said, "Pre-war Baltimore album, 1847, intact and documented. There's a date on the back, and the previous labels say it came from a family in Maryland." Another pause. "Lauralee, I'm going to need you to bring me in." Wallace came to the unit the following week with a colleague he introduced only as Fern, who specialized in American textiles and who looked at the quilt for a very long time without touching it, using a magnifying glass and a pen light, crouching at every angle. When she finally stood up, she said, "The stitching density is extraordinary. This is exceptional work. Museum quality without question." She looked at me. "Do you know its provenance?" There was a manila envelope at the bottom of the crate I hadn't opened yet. I opened it then in front of both of them. Inside was a chain of handwritten receipts and letters going back 4 generations. My great-great-grandmother had purchased the quilt at an estate sale in Baltimore in 1931. Every subsequent owner had kept the documentation. My mother was the last entry. She had written her own name at the bottom of the provenance chain in her small, careful handwriting, and below it, in parentheses, for Lauralee, when the time comes. Fern looked at Wallace. Wallace looked at me. "We need to talk about auction," he said. Here's the part of the story where I have to explain what was happening on the other side of town while I was doing all of this. My brother had wasted no time with the house. He'd listed it within 30 days of my mother's death. He'd hired a staging company, taken the furniture he wanted, and donated the rest without asking me if there was anything I wanted. When I called to ask if I could have my mother's kitchen table, the one we'd sat at every night, the one I'd done homework on for years, he told me the stager said it didn't fit the aesthetic and he'd already had it hauled. He was planning to use the sale proceeds to clear a debt on one of his commercial properties. The house sold in May for $341,000. After fees and taxes, he cleared roughly $280,000, which, as he mentioned to me exactly once, more than covered everything. He did not offer me any portion of it. The will did not require him to. My mother had left the house to him in writing, which was her right, and I respected that. What I did not respect was that he had spent a decade quietly making sure it would go that way, while simultaneously making sure I had nothing to stand on. But my mother had known, she'd always known, and she had been quietly building me a floor while my brother thought she was standing still. In late June, Wallace submitted the collection for auction at a house in Scottsdale that handled American decorative arts and textiles. I had spent 2 months working with him, with Fern, and with a specialist in 19th century American furniture to catalog everything. The Herder Brothers chairs were confirmed, 1879, part of a documented commission. The Rookwood vase was authenticated. Both paintings were attributed to a second-tier Hudson River School painter with a growing collector base. And the quilt. The quilt was the centerpiece. The auction house's specialist, a woman named Dr. Ahern, told me that Baltimore album quilts of this quality and documentation came to auction perhaps once a decade. She said the provenance chain was exceptional. She said she expected significant interest from both private collectors and institutions. She was right. I watched the auction online from my apartment with a glass of water I forgot to drink. The Herder chairs went first, then the Rookwood, then the paintings, then 3 smaller textile pieces from the unit that I hadn't even fully registered as significant. A needlework sampler from 1812, a pair of embroidered panels, a hooked rug that turned out to have Amish origins, and a documented maker. By the time the quilt came up, the running total was already past $180,000. The quilt took 11 minutes to sell. I know because I watched the clock. Final price, $340,000. I had to set my phone down. I sat on my couch in my apartment in Tucson and looked at the ceiling and thought about my mother heating up soup from a can at 11 at night because she'd worked a double. I thought about the birthday card with the combination in it. I thought about the word provenance, where a thing comes from, who held it, how it passed from hand to hand. My mother had been building provenance for me my entire life. She just hadn't been able to tell me yet. Total from the auction, $538,000 after the house's premium. My brother called me 3 days after the auction results posted. He'd seen it. I didn't know how, through the auction house's public results maybe, or someone he knew in that world. It didn't matter. He'd seen the numbers. "You need to talk to me about this," he said. His voice had that smoothed down quality again, but it was under pressure now. I could hear the strain in it. That was Mom's property. Family property. We should have made these decisions together. I let him finish. Then I said, the will gave the storage unit to me specifically. My name. Wallace confirmed the legal standing before we listed anything. My attorney reviewed everything. Your attorney. He repeated it like the words tasted wrong. When did you get an attorney? About 2 weeks after the estate meeting, I said. Around the same time I read the gift record. Silence. That money, he started, was a gift, I said. Your word, her choice, that's what you said. More silence. Then, in a different register entirely, quieter, the rally, I've got a situation with the Chandler property. I need. No, I said. I said it without anger, without satisfaction even. Just as a fact, a clear, simple, complete fact. I'm not going to help you, I said. Not with this, not going forward. I'm not a resource you can draw on. I'm your sister, and that means I'll show up if you're in the hospital, and I'll be civil at whatever family occasions we still attend, But the financial relationship we had, the one where I didn't know I was in it, that's done. He hung up. I'm not going to pretend it didn't affect me. We had grown up in the same house. He had taught me to ride a bike in the driveway on a Sunday morning when I was 6. There are things that are true about a person, and things that are also true about a person, and things that are also true about a person, and they don't cancel each other out. They just sit there together, complicated and heavy and real. But I had spent a long time making myself smaller to accommodate his version of our family. I had accepted, "You're not good with money," when I had never given him any evidence of that. I had apologized for asking questions. I had been grateful for crumbs. And my mother, who had been doing the same thing in her own way for 30 years, had spent her last decade quietly making sure I would land somewhere soft when the arrangement finally collapsed. She could not have known what was in that unit would add up to this. I don't think she planned for $500,000. I think she just knew that the things she'd spent her life protecting had value, and that I was the one who would take the time to find out what kind. She was right. She always was. I used part of the money to pay off my student loans. I put a down payment on a small house. Nothing dramatic, a 1960s ranch in a quiet neighborhood with a yard I'm slowly learning to not kill. I set aside a portion from my own retirement account, which at 31 is later than the financial planners recommend, but earlier than I thought I'd ever manage. And I donated $25,000 to the hospital where my mother worked for 22 years. To their employee hardship fund, specifically the one for staff going through difficult times, the one she had contributed to herself for years with whatever she could spare after covering everyone else. They sent me a letter thanking me. They said her name would be added to a recognition wall in the building's main corridor. I stood in my new living room and read that letter, and it occurred to me that my mother had been adding her name to things quietly her whole life, stitching herself into the fabric of things. And she'd made sure I knew how to find her there if I only thought to look. My brother did not call again after that conversation. His wife sent me a message at Christmas that said, "Hope you're doing well," which I read and did not answer. His commercial property in Chandler eventually went through a short sale, from what I understand. I did not offer to help. I did not feel guilty about not offering to help. I still have the documentation from the quilt. The provenance chain, all 4 generations of it, in my mother's neat handwriting at the end. I had it framed. It hangs in my hallway now, near the front door, so it's the first thing I see when I come home. Some people leave behind houses. Some leave behind money. My mother left behind a paper trail that said, "I saw you. I kept this safe for you. You know what to do." She was right. She always was. I keep thinking about the combination my mother tucked into a birthday card 2 years before she died. I thought it was a mistake. I almost threw the card away. That detail still gets me. How close I came to missing all of it, not just the money, not just the quilt, but the message underneath. The thing she had been trying to say to me for years without having the words, or maybe without having the safety to say it out loud. My brother took the house because he had spent a decade making sure he would. He made himself indispensable on paper. He handled the accounts, the deeds, the conversations with attorneys. He kept me at a distance from all of it by convincing me, and maybe convincing himself, that I wasn't equipped to handle it. "You're not good with money." That sentence did real damage. Not because it was true, but because I was young enough and tired enough to let it sit in me unchallenged for years. What I've come to understand is that what happened wasn't an accident of fate. It was a pattern, built action by action. His choices compounded. The borrowed money never repaid. The documents steered his direction, the slow erosion of my mother's resources. And eventually, that pattern collapsed under its own weight. And my choices compounded too, just differently. Staying curious. Learning to read documents instead of trusting someone else to read them for me. Showing up to that storage unit alone on a Thursday morning when it would have been easier to let my brother handle it and take whatever he decided to give me. My mother had that same quality, even when I couldn't see it. She didn't have a dramatic moment of confrontation. She didn't fight him openly. What she did instead was something quieter and more durable. She paid attention to what was worth protecting, and she protected it. For decades, one monthly payment at a time. She built a provenance chain with her own handwriting, added her name to the bottom, and wrote mine beside it. That is not luck. That is a kind of intelligence that doesn't get enough credit. The intelligence of someone who understands that how you handle the small, invisible things determines what's still standing when everything else falls. I think about Lorelei a year ago. The version of me sitting in that attorney's office, doing math in my head, keeping my face neutral while the gift record was read aloud. I was angry. I am still, sometimes, when I'm honest. But the anger was never the useful part. The useful part was what I did the next morning. I made a list. I called an attorney. I drove 40 minutes into the desert and opened a lock I'd been carrying the combination to for 2 years without knowing why. Doing the right thing quietly over a long time without applause. That's what my mother modeled. It's what Wallace modeled when he took my photographs seriously and told me the truth about what I had. It's what I tried to model in how I handled the auction, the settlement, the phone call with my brother. The $25,000 I gave to the hospital hardship fund won't change anyone's financial trajectory, but it will help someone get through a hard month, and it will put my mother's name on a wall in a building where she gave 22 years of her life. That felt like the only ending that made sense. Not keeping everything. Not spending it on something to prove a point. But returning some of it to the place where she had put so much of herself, so that someone else with less margin might have a little more room to breathe. She left me a floor. I'm trying to build something on it worth the trouble she took.